Right, hi and welcome to the first video on the urinary system. In this video we're just going to go over some kind of general overview stuff about the functions, and then we'll go over anatomy of the kidney and then kind of some microscopic anatomy of the kidney as well. Alright, so let's start with the functions of the kidney. So one of the big functions of the kidney is obviously to eliminate waste in the form of urine. It kind of acts as like a water treatment plant of the body, filtering blood, and urine is formed from that filtering of the blood. And so some waste products that can be found in urine are urea, first of all. And so urea comes from the liver, right? Deamination, which we talked about in metabolism, right? So this forms from deamination. And so if you remember that ammonia made from deamination goes to the liver and is converted into urea. And so then urea is removed in the urine. Okay, and then uric acid is also present in urine as a waste product. This is a metabolic kind of byproduct of nucleic acid breakdown. All right, so when your body breaks down nucleic acids, right, so that's DNA and RNA, they produce uric acid, and so the kidneys will get rid of that in the urine as well. Also associated with uric acid is gout. And so when somebody has an accumulation of uric acid crystals and it deposits in their joints, that's called gout, and it can be very, very painful. And so a lot of time, for that reason, people with gout are recommended not to eat red meat, simply because red meat is made up of skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle cells are multinucleated and therefore contain a lot of DNA. And so that high concentration of nucleic acids is going to produce more uric acid and exacerbate that gout. Okay? So that's urea, uric acid, and then the last waste product you should be familiar with is creatinine. Okay, and so creatinine just results from the metabolism, all right, or breakdown of creatine. All right, and you may remember creatine from skeletal muscle. That's one of the sources of energy, quick energy in skeletal muscle. And so when that's metabolized, you get creatinine, and that's disposed of by the kidneys. Okay, and as we learned in our endocrine chapter, the kidneys produce and also are responsible in some ways for triggering many different hormones. The hormones actually produced by the kidney itself are erythropoietin, which increases red blood cell production. Okay, and calcitriol. So calcitriol is a form of activated vitamin D. Okay, and it's really important because that activated vitamin D functions in increasing calcium absorption in the GI tract, right? So calcium from food, all right, absorbed from food. Okay, so those are two hormones made by the kidney itself. And then we'll talk about some other hormones associated with kidney function later when we get into physiology. The kidney also regulates blood pH. So for example, if the pH gets too low, the kidney can take hydrogen ions from the blood, right, and add them to the urine, and in that way get rid of those hydrogen ions to help restore the pH of the blood. Okay, so associated with this process, right, going from the blood, in this case, to the urine with those hydrogen ions, that is called secretion. And we're going to see these two terms over and over again. So if something is taken from the blood and added to the urine, that is secretion. And if something is taken from the urine and put back into the blood, that is reabsorption. So lots of nutrients that you want to keep, you will reabsorb, your kidneys will reabsorb, put it back into the blood, like glucose and amino acids are going to be reabsorbed. And then secreted things, a lot of these waste products we talked about, as well as hydrogen ions, are going to be secreted. Another major function of the kidney is that it regulates blood pressure. And so it does that because in order to actually form urine, all right, the kidney needs an adequate amount of pressure. So urine is formed by the pressure forcing, that fluid out of the blood. And so if there's not enough pressure, your kidneys can't form urine. So the kidneys do have the ability to regulate blood pressure. And one hormone that does that is renin. Okay, and so renin would increase blood pressure. The kidneys also help to maintain fluid balance in the body. So if your blood becomes too salty, right? Maybe you're dehydrated. So your blood is you would say it has a high osmolarity. What the kidneys are going to do is they're going to take water, all right, and move it from the urine into the blood. Okay, so that would be reabsorption. So it would increase water reabsorption, putting it from the urine into the blood. And then that way the blood would be a little more diluted and you can maintain that fluid balance. And then lastly, the kidney is one source of gluconeogenesis. And so in the kidney is where amino acids can be converted into glucose. So if you remember, amino acid, you can remove that nitrogen group by deaminating and then convert that into pyruvate, and that pyruvate can be converted into glucose, and that would happen in the kidneys. Okay, so that's our overview. All right, so functions, our overview of functions. Now let's talk about anatomy. All right, so kidney anatomy specifically. So the kidneys are retroperitoneal. They are bean-shaped organs, as you see here. And they are located around the 12th, kind of between the 12th thoracic rib, right, and the 3rd lumbar rib. They're kind of situated there on your posterior abdominal wall behind the peritoneum. The right kidney is actually a little lower than the left kidney, simply due to the positioning of the liver kind of pushes that kidney down a little bit. Okay. So first we're going to talk about the coverings on the outside of the kidney, and then we'll start looking at this picture here and labeling some of the structures. So on the outside of the kidney, there's 3 layers. All right, so we're going to go from the outermost and work our way in towards the kidney. All right, so the outermost layer is called the renal fascia. All right, so this renal fascia is going to help to hold the kidney in place, right, because it kind of sits up on that abdominal wall, and so that's going to be one function of this renal fascia, is to kind of help anchor it. And then underneath that renal fascia, there's going to be a lot of fat kind of surrounding the kidney. That fat is called perirenal fat, and it protects and kind of cushions the kidney. Because again, that kidney is sitting on the abdominal wall, and it's possible, like a blow to that area where your kidney is located, if it's, at T12, right, that's where your last rib is, and so part of your kidney sticks out below your rib cage, so it is a little exposed, and that perirenal fat will kind of help to protect it in its location. Okay. And then we have, sitting kind of directly on the surface of the kidney, we have the renal capsule. Okay, so this is on the surface. Okay, and that would just protect that kidney from any kind of infection or anything being able to penetrate into the organ. All right, so now let's look at this picture. So let's start kind of with some basics and get into some more detailed stuff. So with the kidney, we divide the kidney into different major regions. So we have here, right, we have our cortex and our medulla. So the cortex is the outermost part, all right, so this would be the cortex. And then just below it here, all right, where we have these kind of little triangular shaped series of lines, that is called the medulla. Okay, so if I were to kind of fill in on this whole kidney, this all the way around the edge, that's the cortex, all right, all the way around here. And then this section here, all the way around, is the medulla, okay? And so then the medulla is made up of a few different regions, all right? So you can see these kind of, I was talking about triangle-shaped areas here, all right? These are called renal pyramids. Okay, so this would be one renal pyramid here, all right, and we'd have another one here. And then those renal pyramids, kind of the point, the apex of the pyramid, if we drew it here, will sit in this kind of little cup-shaped area. All right, that kind of point of the renal pyramid that sits in the little cup, that little cup's actually going to collect that urine that's been formed. That area is called the renal papilla. Okay, so it's kind of where the point of that renal pyramid meets that little kind of collecting area. Okay, and then between those renal pyramids, we have our columns. All right, so renal columns would be located between pyramids, so they would be here and here. Typically, there's going to be a lot of larger blood vessels moving up through those renal columns. Okay, good. And so then, so we have our cortex, we have our medulla. In the medulla, we have our renal pyramids and our columns. And so then if we keep going more internally, we have this kind of large area here. That is called the renal pelvis. And so that's the major region, kind of a cone-shaped area where all that urine kind of collects to. That is our renal pelvis here. Okay, and so the regions that drain to the renal pelvis do have special names. So if we have a kind of little, we talked about these cup-shaped areas like this and this. All right, so one little cup that goes to one pyramid is called a minor calyx. All right, so that would be one minor calyx here. All right, we could have another minor calyx here. All right, so one minor calyx goes to one renal pyramid, and then they'll kind of collect together, as you can see here, and form what's called a major calyx. So a major calyx would contain urine from multiple renal pyramids. All right, a minor calyx like this or like this would only contain urine from one renal pyramid. Okay, and so then all those major calyces join together to form that renal pelvis. Okay, and then that renal pelvis is going to drain out into the ureter, which will then carry that urine to the bladder. Okay, and then lastly, we have these blood vessels that are entering and leaving the kidneys. So the large artery here is the renal artery, and the large vein is the renal vein. So that renal artery is going to take blood into the kidney, up kind of between those pyramids in that column, and then the actual formation of urine from that blood is going to occur in the cortex of the kidney. All right, and we'll look at that when we look at the nephron structure. Okay, and so then our last word here is the renal hilum. And so we had this word hilum before with the lungs. All right, and if you remember, that is just the region, right, kind of called like the root of the lungs or the root of the kidney, where all of these structures, so the ureter and the arteries and the veins, all enter and exit. So that is the renal hilum. Okay, great. So now let's talk about nephrons. All right, so nephrons, if we're looking here, all right, this is kind of what we're looking at with the nephron. So I'm going to kind of show you where this would be located relative to the whole kidney we were just looking at. So when we're looking at a nephron, we're really interested, the actual nephron is all this kind of light blue stuff, right? So we have this portion here with the little capillary bed, and then we have all these tubes, these winding tubes, and then these winding tubes here, all right? So all of that, this whole region is going to be located in the cortex. And then this kind of little dip, right, this loop here is going to extend down into the pyramid. Okay, so if we're looking at our kidney here, right, we're going to have our little ball with our capillaries. We're going to have all these winding tubes kind of up in here, and then that little loop dips down like this into that pyramid. Okay, so that's kind of how the nephron is arranged when we're looking at it kind of in our next section. Okay, so let's look at nephron structure and talk about some of these important parts and what they do. Okay, so in each kidney you have approximately 1 million nephrons. All right, so there are many of these packed in all together in each kidney. And they are the functional unit of the kidney, right? So this nephron is what is forming that urine from the blood. So they're the functional unit of the kidney, just like an alveolus where, exchange of gases is the functional unit of the lungs. Okay? And so we're going to start off with the region where that blood is filtered to form kind of the precursor for urine. And so that is going to be here in this structure, which is called the renal corpuscle. Okay, so the renal corpuscle, right, that's this word here. The renal corpuscle has two parts. So the first part is going to be that capillary bed kind of sitting in the middle. That's called the glomerulus. All right, so this is the glomerulus, is the capillary bed. And then there's this kind of cup structure surrounding it. That's called the Bowman's capsule. All right, so that's going to be this structure here. Okay, so the renal corpuscle is made up of the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule that surrounds it. And so if we zoom into kind of this little section here of Bowman's capsule and glomerulus, that's what we're looking at in this picture. And so I just want to talk about, this will be kind of even more microscopic, the cells that you find there. Okay, so when we look at this image, the Bowman's capsule would be this outer layer here, right? That specifically is the parietal layer of the Bowman's capsule, and it's just made of simple squamous. Okay, so this light blue layer here would just simply be simple squamous cells. Okay, and then when we look at the capillary, we have, right, so this would be our capillary. You can see the simple squamous of the capillary. There are cells sitting on top of the capillary, these kind of teal cells here. Those teal cells make up the visceral layer of the Bowman's capsule. All right, so these are the layers of the Bowman's capsule, just so we're clear. Okay, so the Bowman's capsule has a parietal layer made up of simple squamous. It has a visceral layer made up of cells called podocytes. And they're called podocytes because podo refers to feet, right? And they have like these little feet that kind of interlock with each other. And those are the podocytes. So each of these would be a podocyte, and they form kind of this barrier for that filtrate, right, to be formed. So the blood will filter through this simple squamous cell and then through the little gaps in between these cells before it actually becomes part of the kind of urine precursor. All right, and so when it does that, it's going to move out of this capillary bed and collect in this area called the capsular space. So that capsular space is just where that urine precursor that we call filtrate, it's where that filtrate collects. Okay, so filtrate collects. Okay, good. And we'll talk more about the podocytes and kind of their function a little later. This is just mainly more about the anatomy and kind of the structures that we're looking at now, not so much the physiology. All right, so that is our renal corpuscle, so that's this part. So there, the initial filtrate's going to be formed. It's going to collect in kind of this gaps here, right, and in between those capillaries. And from there, it's going to move onward to this kind of winding, looping tubule here. All right, so this is called the proximal convoluted tubule. That's this guy here. Okay, so it's proximal because it's closest to that renal corpuscle, and convoluted because it's so windy and coiled and it kind of turns back on itself. So proximal convoluted tubule. The tissue found here is going to be simple cuboidal with microvilli, so it's going to have these extensions, all right, kind of like the cells of the small intestine of the plasma membrane. That's because here is where a lot of reabsorption is going to occur. So remember, moving things from that filtrate back into the blood, so things that you want to keep. Okay, good. So then from there, that filtrate is going to travel through this loop, and this loop is called the loop of Henle. Okay, so it's this whole section here. That's the loop of Henle. So the loop of Henle has a descending limb. Sometimes it's called the thin limb, and that's because the tissue found there is simple squamous. Sometimes it'll even be drawn like a little more narrow like this. That's the descending thin limb. And then we have the ascending limb here, right, that is made up of simple cuboidal cells. So these simple cuboidal cells would not have microvilli. Right, and so then from the loop of Henle, that filtrate is going to travel through this next winding convoluted tubule. This one is called the distal convoluted tubule. Okay, so this is the distal convoluted tubule. All right. Okay, so that's the pathway. Oh, and then from there, I don't have this labeled, so I'll just add it in. All right, that filtrate would travel into this kind of large duct here called a collecting duct. So that collecting duct is going to receive filtrate from many, many nephrons, right? Those nephrons are all going to be here, right, dropping their filtrate into this, okay? And so our last kind of topic for this nephron is going to be blood flow. So we've talked about the pathway of the filtrate with our different tubules. And so then there's obviously also blood flow in this nephron. So we have our glomerulus, which is our capillary bed. Associated with that glomerulus, you have two arterioles. You have the arteriole that's entering the glomerulus. That's going to be the afferent arteriole. Typically, that afferent arteriole is going to be drawn a little larger, a little thicker, because the smooth muscle in that wall is thicker. All right, and it's also going to be entering from a larger artery here. All right, so you'll see it enter. Then that blood will travel through the glomerulus, all right, where it will be filtered, and then it will leave here through this efferent arteriole. Okay, which I don't have written, so I'm going to add it here. All right, so efferent arteriole is here. Okay, and so then from there, the blood would travel through these kind of series of capillaries that are going to wrap all around all of these tubules. So if you remember, we talked about how, particularly in the proximal convoluted tubule, a lot of reabsorption happens. Remember, reabsorption is taking something from that filtrate and putting it back into the blood. So obviously you need a blood supply there to put it back into. All right, and so that would be these little capillaries. And so these are all called the peritubular capillaries. It's really all of these capillaries that are surrounding all of these tubules here. Okay, so then they would finally leave through that renal vein right out of the kidney. Okay, and then our last structure for our nephron is the juxtaglomerular apparatus. All right, so when we're looking at the juxtaglomerular apparatus, let me kind of draw an arrow of where you would see this on our actual nephron. So that would be here, all right, is where that juxtaglomerular apparatus is. So it's made up of the afferent arteriole here, all right, actually comes next to this distal convoluted tubule. Okay, so if we were to kind of box this in, I don't really want to draw over my arrows. There we go. All right, this would be the juxtaglomerular apparatus here. Okay, so we have our, and I'll just label it, our distal convoluted tubule, all right, and it's sitting next to our afferent arteriole here. Okay, and so together, and we're going to talk about this in a lot more detail with the physiology, but together they function, they contain specialized cells, all right, that are going to detect different, changes in blood pressure, and they're going to help to regulate that blood pressure, because remember, it's very important for maintaining urine production. So the juxtaglomerular apparatus, made up of the distal convoluted tubule and the afferent arteriole, because that distal convoluted tubule always kind of loops back near that afferent arteriole, and they're going to regulate blood pressure together. Okay? All right, so that's it for this video. In the next video, we'll start on some physiology.